Hello and welcome back to the latest installment of the Music History Project. Today we're very excited to have a special guest with us as we talk about Big Star drummer and Ardent Studios CEO Jody Stephens. Welcome to the Music History Project. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth Dale.
And Dan Del Fiorentino.
And Mike Mullins.
All of our content comes from the Oral History Program, which is sponsored by NAM, the National Association of Music Merchants. And that is a program that is over 3,000 interviews and constantly growing. If you want to check out any of our content or any of the other interviews that aren't featured, please check out our website at www.nam.org/library. All right, so we're here today with our favorite reoccurring guest, our only reoccurring guest, Zach Phillips.
Yay.
Hi, Zach.
Hey, all.
Welcome, Zach.
Very thrilled to be here.
Well, you know, originally it was Zach's idea for me to interview Jody, so it seemed only fitting to have you here with us in the studio to record this podcast, which we're very thrilled. Having Jody as a part of the NAM Oral History interview program has been awesome. So taking this interview, dissecting it, playing the whole thing today, talking about it with a Big Star fan, I think is very fitting. So very, very happy about it.
Thank you, Dan. It's thrilling.
So I guess a good place to start is just to talk a little bit about Jody and Big Star and why we are gathered here today. Do you want to give us a little of your impression of the background of the importance of Big Star?
You know, there's that great quote by Brian Eno about the Velvet Underground that they only made they only sold 30,000 albums, and every single person who bought one formed a band. And I think that couldn't be more applicable to Big Star. This is a band that I think went on to form the groundwork of indie rock, even though they weren't always recognized for it, influencing everybody from REM to Wilco to Teenage Fan Club, and the list goes on, and even contemporaries. So one of the great unheralded bands in rock history, and they made 3 perfect albums. Really the indie rock and power pop pioneers.
Absolutely. Well, and the whole idea of the alternative rock genre really kind of grew up around this concept of what they created, and the power pop, absolutely, without a doubt. And most importantly, and the point that I think I glean mostly from your comment, is the influence. We're still talking about this band because they are still important. Their work is still influencing people, and not just bands and not just musicians who want to get together with their buddies, but guys in the studio who say, wow, I want to mix an album like that. I want to bring in strings like that. I want to do this. I want to do that. So that's what's really awesome from our position in the music products industry, to see them inspire other people in our industry, not just musicians.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that great Peter Buck of REM quote where he said, REM will never make an album as good as Big Star's 3rd album. So that sort of says it all. And, you know, Paul Westerberg, one of the great singer-songwriters of our time, wrote a song about Alex Chilton, the founder of Big Star. You can't get much better accolades than that.
No doubt. So, Elizabeth, tell us, where are we going to start with our interview with Jody?
We're going to first hear Jody talking about music as a child when he was growing up, one of Dan's all-time favorite questions, as well as his relationship with his brother, some concerts, playing the bass, and also about Al Jackson and his first kit and the first #1 record. That's a lot.
That is a lot.
All right, Mike, go.
Here we go.
Well, one of the things I was hoping to talk with you about is your passion for music and how that developed. Did you have a lot of music in your house when you were a kid?
My dad played guitar early on, and but around the house we had an upright Steinway that they'd bought used someplace, and and Dad would play that from time to time, and then my older brother Jimmy kind of picked it up. But it's interesting, they would have bridge parties at the house, and have other couples over, and they would play these Reader's Digest sort of mood albums, like Hawaiian Music was one of them. And we had this, this console stereo that they would play those things on. So not really. But with the advent of the Beatles, and I think our next door neighbor, Billy McMahon, had just bought Meet the Beatles, and we went over next door and had a listen, and kind of caught fire with us. And that's where our passion for it all. And then, we heard stories about these guys from England and their haircuts and all that sort of thing, even a little prior to that. And then, wow, I think he had Meet the Beatles before February of '64 when they did Ed Sullivan. And then we watched Ed Sullivan, and then it was just, forget it. That was a passion, that was a pursuit, and we knew what we were going to be doing, or try to do anyway.
Had you played the drums before that?
No, I was 13 maybe, '64 February, so no, I was 65, I was 11.
Oh.
I was born 52, 60, yeah, I was 11. So I hadn't picked up drums yet, and maybe by the time '66, which is when the Beatles played in Memphis, played here on August 1966, and of course my brother and I had tickets, and we went to exchange our nighttime tickets to matinee tickets, because my brother was in a band. He was 16, he was in a band with Andy Hummel. And they got a gig that night, and we had exchanged our tickets, and we thought, well, what the hell, we'll sneak backstage and see if we can catch a glimpse, and we got caught, and they took our tickets away from us. But, so I'm kind of digressing. We had done that at a Rolling Stones concert at the Coliseum. We kind of snuck back where, the trucks would come in, limos and stuff, and saw them get out of their car, and that was fun. And we walked out, and it was all pretty innocent. And so, I don't know. Yeah, that sparked the passion, and then all the other kind of British invasion artists kind of fueled that. And then Stax came along, and Sam and Dave, and Otis Redding, and my brother Jimmy and I put a soul band together, and my brother played bass, and because that stuff gave me chill bumps too. Al Jackson, and somebody once asked me, what kind of influence do you think Al Jackson was? And I pointed to, there's a Big Star song called Life is Right, and starts off with just 2 and 4 on the hi-hat, and then I go da 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 da, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, like Al Jackson did in Try a Little Tenderness, because he started off with that simple beat, and then once he changed to 1, 2, 3, 4 on the kind of cross snare thing, the whole song just, wow, took on a different feel, and that was a powerful moment. Something as simple as that, and the power it had made an impact. So that's kind of what I did on Life is Right, the intro there.
Did you see him at all perform, or was he mostly doing recordings?
I never saw Al Jackson perform live that I can remember. I remember seeing the Barkays. They played a dance, and never got to see Otis Redding. My wife got to see Otis Redding, but never got to see him. I don't think except for the Barkays, I don't think I ever saw any of the Stax artists live. But I got I met Isaac Hayes a few times, and we would frequent Whole Foods here. That's kind of run into him there.
How did you get your first kit?
My parents bought me my first kit. It was probably a kit from the 50s, because it was already old, and it was just 2 mounted toms, bass drum, and a snare, no floor. And I'd been playing snare drum in the junior high 7th grade band and 8th grade, and I don't know why I even bothered to go on into 8th grade with it. I guess because it was just, at least I got to play a drum, and but it all had nothing to do with what I really wanted to do, and I couldn't, even after all that time, I couldn't really read music. I just kind of memorize what people were doing before me and play it back whenever that band director would get to me. I was always like fourth or fifth chair. So that's when I got that first kit, and then I replaced that kit right after number one record, and got a new kind of bigger set of Ludwigs, and it was kind of the first oversized kit that they put together and put out, and so I've had that ever since. Served me well.
Okay, so what is your impression, Mike, when you just hear his voice? I mean, this is a guy who obviously is very passionate about what he does. What comes to your mind when you hear these stories?
I mean, it just sounds like someone who is doing exactly what they were meant to do, being around music and just consuming everything related to music. It's just he's living the dream, as they say.
And what's behind this to me is there's a real tragic story behind Jody, and even though it's not something he brings up in every conversation, he hasn't yet talked about it in the interview, but just in his aged voice, if that's a term I can use. To me, he is very methodical about what he says. He's very meaningful about what he says. And I think the reason for that is he has lived through an awful lot and wants to just kind of get to the point, and he wants to make his statement. And that makes for a very compelling podcast interview for sure. Any thoughts on that, Zach?
He's the only surviving member of Big Star, and he carries that torch, I think, with great humility, and he represents the band's legacy in a beautifully elegant way. This is somebody who, he's not only a great drummer, but he also penned a couple of Big Star's most memorable songs. So, I think of him as he's one of the great custodians of a legacy in rock music.
And if we can make a little plug to our membership that have retail stores, I think it's important to pause for a minute and talk a little bit about the birth of this band and where they grew up and how they formed in Memphis, Tennessee, surrounded by the accessibility of musical instruments, and having a fantastic variety of music stores in and around that area. I think was certainly a big part of it. I mean, we have friends at Amro Music who have provided musical instruments for Stack Records, and I think Booker T of the MGs got his very first musical instrument over there. It was a clarinet, not a Hammond B3. Of course, Elvis and all his buddies got their instruments over at a place called OK Hauk, which is where B.B. King got his. I mean, just in that small little area of one city, there are a number of important stores, a couple of which don't get brought up too often in the interviews, but Jody brings them up as being very influential for him. And I think that's Melody Music and the great Memphis Drum Shop over there. Have you been to either?
I'm afraid to say I haven't, but I do know Memphis Drum Shop well. And something to add about Memphis Drum Shop, Jody talks about just the sheer quantity of drums, that it's a drummer's paradise. They also have mycymbal.com, which was a pioneer in showcasing cymbals online, using sound clips of cymbals and really kind of selling the romance of cymbals online. They were a pioneer in doing that. If I can add something too, Dan, something that struck me when I listened to this interview with Jody was, what were they putting in the water in Memphis? There was so much talent that came out of this city that, I mean, we thought about all the musical talent, but I think the one gentleman who worked at Ardent was the founder of, was it FedEx or American Express? Some
right. Major
organization. So there are all these little threads with Ardent and Stax that kind of carried out into the business community as well in Memphis.
Yeah, good point. So let's get back to the interview. What are we going to hear next?
We're going to hear Jody talking about just that, growing up in Memphis, the shops he went to, and where he kind of dabbled in getting his instruments.
I don't know what the era was, but there was a OK Hauk music store. Did you ever go to? Was that gone by the time you were?
I remember that, but I don't know. I can't ever remember visiting that. It was melody music, which is where I bought my drum kit. And, of course, now there's the Memphis Drum Shop, and it's like the Disney World of drum shops. It's amazing. They have a room that's probably 50 by 50 or something, and it's nothing but cymbals, and they have all these drum kits set up, and it really is. It's an amazing sight to behold. But yeah, Melody just had one drum kit set up, and that happened to be the kit that I was looking for. And it took me 15 seconds to say, "Hey, I'll take that one."
So that was Jody talking about visiting Melody Music and the Memphis Drum Shop. And next, we're going to be hearing him speaking about getting together the band and the production of Hair at Memphis State.
So tell me how the band got together.
Andy Hummel had played, as I mentioned earlier, had played in a band with my brother, but I hadn't seen him in a few years, and my brother and I had a band together with actually 3 lead singers, and we were just doing cover stuff, and one of the lead singers wanted to audition for Hair. It would be the first college production of Hair at the university. Well, it was then Memphis State, but it's now the University of Memphis. And his name was Don McNatt, and he said we should audition as a band. And I was still in high school. I was a senior. And I thought, well, I could do that. I mean, other than that, I would have been scared to death to just go audition as a drummer. And we auditioned kind of as a band, and we passed the audition. Don McNatt got one of the leads. He played Berger, and my brother and I were the bass and drums in the band, and actually the rest of the band wound up not doing it. So at any rate, I'm making a short story long. So we were doing Hair at Memphis State, and Andy Hummel comes to see it. And Andy and I talk after the show, and he said, "Hey, we're looking for a drummer. You want to come over and jam at what was turned out to be Chris Bell's back house?" And did, and it opened up a new path for me. I mean, if he hadn't posed that question, I wouldn't be here now at Ardent. Pretty amazing.
It is amazing.
I mean, there are a lot of traffic directors, so to speak, in life, and Andy was a big one.
So did they already have material, or did you guys work on that together?
Well, it was that was just kind of a jam thing. We just played songs that we were all familiar with, British Invasion stuff, I would think, and that evolved in just kind of a core band being me, Chris, and Andy, and we would do some. Chris knew how to engineer at that point, and John Fry, I was 17, Chris was 18. John gave us keys to the studio, and so we could go in after the Staple Singers and Terry Manning finished mixing. We could go in and just putz around and experiment, which Chris did a lot of, and as well as Steve Ray. And so we did that from March to maybe December of 70, and then Alex was looking to move back to Memphis from New York, and he came to see us at a VFW hall. It wasn't a VFW event, I forget whatever it was, and I guess that worked out because Alex joined us, and at that point we started working up original material, and that it was exciting before, but it was really exciting after that because I'd gone from it's one thing to play drums covering somebody else's song because the drum part's there. But to see these guys create guitar parts of their own and then, be looked to create drum parts and stuff, it got challenging and it got interesting and a little kind of daunting at first. But, once they started presenting songs, stuff like Ballad of El Goodo, I don't know, it just all clicked because it was pretty much there, and then I would just go back and develop things and kind of fine-tune stuff. So,
was your brother part of the band at any point?
No, he wasn't. But he did, however. played bass on For You on Big Star's third album. Yeah, because, Andy quit after Radio City, and so I brought Jimmy in to play bass on that.
And how did you guys come up with the name?
Ardent was located on National in kind of north part of Memphis, and there was a Big Star grocery store right across the street. There's a Big Star, and then there's a Sweden Cream, which was kind of like an independent Dairy Queen or whatever. And I think maybe Chris and Andy, maybe Alex was part of it. I don't know. I think John didn't like people smoking in the studio, so they went outside and to share a joint or something probably, and lo and behold, there's Big Star. And I guess it could have been Big Star Sweden Cream, and they decided on Big Star. And the whole pretense, number one record was a reference to a chart position. It wasn't the fact that it was our number one record.
Okay, so which one of you did not know the story about Big Star and how they got their name? Zach, did you already know that story?
I mean, I've scoured the far corners of the internet wondering what kind of upright bass was used on some of the tracks on Big Star Third. So not a surprise, but pretty cool hearing Jody talk about it,
doubt.
Getting that straight from the source.
We could have Mike edit out the part where I admit I hadn't never listened to this band ever. So I didn't know. Go figure, I didn't know.
That's embarrassing. Don't bring that up.
We won't tell anybody.
The least embarrassing thing I've done in this office.
Zach's like, why'd you hire her?
Yeah, just go home. Oh, okay, bye.
To be you and be able to hear those albums for the first time. That's
See,
actually what I'm thinking.
That's it. It's all about perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so while we're talking about the origins of the band, I think it's really cool that Jody brought up the Ardent president, the founder of that record label and recording studio in Memphis, and that's John Fry, who I always had a big appreciation for this guy. Kind of underground, didn't make a lot of noise about his own career, although he recorded and engineered some amazing groups over the years in that little studio. He was also one of the very first folks that we interviewed for the NAMM Oral History program. So he really set me straight as to some of the important innovators in recording and studio design that I otherwise probably would not have known. So very, very cool to have that opportunity. John Fry was born in 1944 and passed away in 2014. On December the 18th, which ironically was just 6 days away from when John Hampton, who was the engineer also at Ardent, passed away, just a couple of days from each other, both of which I got to interview on that day in 2000 for the NAMM Oral History program. So interestingly, sitting in the exact same recording studio with Jody and talking about these guys was really kind of surreal in some respects, because he had a lot of admiration for them, certainly knew them more than I did, and was able to provide me with background information and funny stories and insight as to why these guys were so magical and what they produced and created there at Ardent. So that was a whole other aspect of the interview that you'll hear me asking about, in addition to his own career, just because, wow, we had this wonderful opportunity.
And this is probably a perfect time to plug the fact that we have a Ardent Studios tag as of today.
With the three people that we'll be hearing about today.
Yes. So you can... You can go online and check out some other interviews tied to Jody Stephens through that Ardent connection by visiting what web address, Mike?
That would be namm.org, namm.org/library.
So where are we to go next?
I think Mike should tell us.
Next up, we're going to hear a story about Radio City, and then Jody talking about his first impressions with John Fry, how they met, and then John creating his own studio.
And Radio City kind of worked its way into that too, though I don't think it was intentional. Andy Hummel came up with Radio City because he thought we had a lot of radio-friendly songs. And back then, if something was like, say, something was a drag, something was disappointing, you'd say drag city. You'd tag city onto the end of something. And so, he thought it was a lot of radio stuff, so he called it Radio City. It wasn't, I'm sure it probably worked better because of the Radio City Music Hall kind of aspect too, but yeah.
That's really cool. Tell me about John Fry, your first encounter with him and your impression of him.
John Fry, I was 17, so that would have made John 25. And so Chris Bell introduces me to John Fry and in his office over there on National. And, we talk, and he's this very, very matured, grown-up, not really formal, but an adult. So we talk, and it was kind of fascinating because he obviously was a really bright guy. But there's one thing that struck me, and so after Chris and I think we walked on into the studio, and Chris shut the door in the studio, I looked at Chris and I said, he sounds so much like Jimmy Stewart. And Chris said, yeah, everybody tells him that, so don't tell him that. So that was my first encounter with John Fry.
And what did you later learn about his background and how he came to creating his own studio?
Wow, probably not till a few years later, really. But then, of course, the story is John started it when he was 14 at his parents' house. His parents converted the garage into kind of a proper play space, if you will, and John Fry and Fred Smith and John King, three playmates got together, and I think they bought some shortwave radio stuff, and I think they were doing pirate radio, doing like a little pirate radio station on shortwave, and John thought, well, gee, if we added some mics, we could record some bands. And so at 14, John and I guess Fred Smith and John King all came up with the name Ardent and the logo, and it was incorporated. And John Fry had his first single in his hand by the time he was a month into being 15 years old. I mean, a precocious kid. They all were. Of course, Fred Smith went on to found Federal Express, and John King went on to do album promotion work, and John's the guy who put all that sort of infamous rock writers convention together here that took place in 1973, and Cameron Crowe and Lester Snell and Bud Scappa and Richard Meltzer and all these sort of, they came to be sort of iconic music writers were there. So yeah, I'm making a short story long, sorry.
No, that's awesome. It really is very interesting to me. We were talking about some of the music stores in Memphis. Also, not to be outdone, are those who created the recording studios there in Memphis. Not only Ardent, which we're talking about in focus today with Jody, but some of the others that we're going to be hearing about, Stax in particular. Just amazing what was going on in that city. Probably best known in the early days of rock and roll and rockabilly is Sun Records there in town, but High was over there as well as some others, and the American Studios. Just an amazing wealth of recordings going on, and what was cool is what Jody gleaned from that and was able to, even as the drummer of the band, way before he owned the studio, way before he was doing his own recordings and engineering, was still gleaning what he had learned from these guys and trying to produce the perfect album. What are your thoughts about that, Zach? I mean, you can hear it, can't you?
Oh, yeah. A couple things that struck me listening to the interview with Jody. He refers multiple times to the shine and sparkle that John Fry would get when he recorded. And you hear that influence throughout all of Big Star's albums, especially on the first two albums, Number One Record and Radio City. Those albums are very deliberately treble heavy. It's not to say they lack bass. There's a significant amount of treble. So he left that sonic footprint or fingerprint on that. the other thing that strikes me is these folks were really young. I mean, Alex Chilton was probably in his early 20s. I think Jody said he was 19 at the time. So this reminds me of that, if anybody's read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about like people like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and Bill Gates having access to these massive computers in certain university towns, and they were able to tinker on those as children, or young people at least. And that was one of the reasons they had such a leg up on other people in the home computing revolution. You really get that sense when you listen to this interview. They were in the presence of a great studio at the time, and they were given some keys to really play around in there. And in fact, a story, and it's apparently not apocryphal, it's true. Chris Bell, the other singer in Big Star and major songwriter on the first album, actually produced or put together Number One Record as a college thesis project. I hope he got an A on that, because it's one of the great debut albums of all time. But again, it just shows you these were young folks playing around in the studio and having a blast and making some of the most beautiful rock music of our time.
What a thesis project. Mine was
right?
awful.
I know.
Like,
Chris Bell made Number One Record.
Yeah. I wrote like a 60-page paper. It was awful. All right, so let's get back to our interview with Jody, and we're going to be hearing him talking all about his experiences creating his first record.
So he rented a place over on National in 1966, and at the time he put that console in, the guy he was talking to was a Spectrasonics kind of guy, and he told John, he said, you should get what Stax is getting, so Stax can come over and work, and their engineers don't have to learn a new console. So we did. And it was there from 66 to 71, and Al Bell was trying to grow Stax into like an Atlantic or Columbia Records, and so he was signing lots of artists and having tremendous amount of success and hits, and the Staple Singers being one of those, and not to mention Isaac Hayes and those folks, and so John, knew that there was a demand for two studios. So in '70, he bought this property over here and then built this building from scratch. And we were here. We moved in Thanksgiving of '71 and have been here since, 46 years or something. A while.
Were you here when they moved in?
I was.
You were part of it.
Yeah, I was part of it because that was '71, and I'd been around since March. And so we started Number One Record. We tracked it at the old studio, and then we overdubbed and mixed here in this room, actually. Not this console, but in this room anyway.
And what was that experience like for you?
Thrilling. Because it's funny, being creative is can be uncomfortable, and but when you kind of get through it and come up with something that you like, it's really exciting. So yeah, we'd go out on the studio floor and do things and record things and come back in the control room, and John just had such an amazing set of ears and was so good with all kinds of processors and knew how they work, because we have EMTs here, plate reverb, and we have real echo chambers here, and we have all kinds of things like Fairchilds and UAs and a lot of different kind of processing gear back then. And John was a creative guy, so he would just make it shine, make it sparkle. So it was awesome.
And what was it like in the band? I mean, we hear a lot of stories about rock bands and getting along at first and then sort of growing in different ways, but you guys seem to always be on the same page, at least the first couple of albums. What was that like for you?
I think, well, Chris, Alex joined and we did Number One Record, and then Chris left the band, and there were no personality problems. It was just Chris thought that the focus would be on Alex, because Alex had been in the Box Tops, and the writers Alex was that kind of common denominator. A music writer would say, you haven't heard of Big Star, but you've heard of Alex Chilton because he was in the Box Tops. And I think Chris thought he might have to live under that shadow, and so Chris left the band. We all stayed friends. And then actually Big Star sort of drifted apart. And then John King got us back together to do this rock writers convention that I mentioned, and rock writers back then were our only audience, because John saw to it that they got our number one record, and they all wrote great, or at least most of them wrote great things about it. So John King talked us into doing that, and so we came back together and rehearsed a little bit and played that. I just saw it as being an underdog, and there was no real intention of anything, I think, with regards to what we might get out of it. It was just going to be a good time. And so we played that, and everybody knew the songs, the lyrics, and just went nuts. The free bar, the open bar probably helped. And so we thought, let's do another record. And so we kind of came back together and got Radio City together, and which we had already probably demoed a couple of songs that were going to be on Radio City anyway. So, and we're starting to work up things. So, Radio City came together, and we did that, and that was a good time. It was sonically something different, and we were a three-piece, so the approach was different. There's more space to maybe do things with as a drummer, and and then Andy quit after Radio City, even before its release. I think we all three went up to New York and did Columbia had just picked up distribution, so we did a few days at Max's Kansas City and then come home, and I think Andy just thought he could never make a career out of it, so he quit and went back to school full time, which he and I were doing anyway, but part time, and so that left Alex and me, and I just loved the process of recording, and Alex. So we just clicked musically, and as I did with Andy and Chris, and so it was there was that high that'd come with creating whatever drum part for something, because Alex always had these brilliant songs and melodies, and so he and I did the third album, brought in different people like my brother on For You, and a guy named Tommy Cathy played bass on a lot, and Carl Marsh, I brought Carl in to do string arrangements for You, a song that I wrote, and because I was thinking, Eleanor Rigby and the strings on that, and that'd be cool. And I knew Carl had those talents as an arranger, and so brought Carl in to do that, and then Alex thought, wow, that sounds good. Maybe we should try it on a few other things. And that's how Carl wound up doing strings for the other songs on the record.
So Carl did the strings on the record, and I would love to just talk a little bit more about, since we have the Big Star's biggest fan in the building with us, Zach Phillips, joining us.
Oh, I thought you meant me.
Oh, sorry. And the second.
You have to listen to the albums first, Elizabeth.
Oh, bird. Okay, I'll go home.
Okay, so what from the first album comes to mind when you think of the magic of the band?
Big Star's first album, to me, is one of those albums that seems totally fully formed and fully realized out of the gate. A lot of great artists just don't have great debut albums. Number One Record is a great debut album. Every song's perfect. Again, that metaphor, or I guess description that Jody has of the sparkle and shine of that studio is throughout it, both literally and metaphorically, in terms of the sonic landscape of that album. It's just a perfect album. So many songs came off that album that we've heard in commercials, or some band that we love has covered. So it's an amazing album. And again, the fact that Chris Bell did it in part as a college thesis project. It's just a fun little aside.
Well, and I like the flow of it, too. If you listen very carefully, and after you've heard it about a dozen times, you realize there's really a very interesting thought process that went into what song follows the next. And I think that's another key. It kind of goes back to the early days of albums, LPs in the 40s and 50s when they called them mood albums. Yeah. There's not too many rock albums that are mood albums for obvious reasons, but I think that Big Star was able to accomplish that, at least in their first album.
Absolutely. The everything from the sequencing to the production, there's such an attention to detail on that album. Yeah. It's really amazing to hear something so fully realized out of the gate from a band.
So I think up next we're going to talk a little bit more, have Jody fill us in on John Fry and how he had this great vision. And interestingly, we hear this quite often in the music industry about some mentor seeing something in you that you didn't even know you had in yourself. And I think Jody was a little bit surprised that there was a marketing position open at the Ardent Studios for which John really felt he would be perfect for. So let's hear that story.
Then we did that, and then, I just didn't see a way forward after that. And so I left and just went back to school full time for a minute and played in other bands and finished school and waited tables. And in December or November of 1986, I called John Fry and told him I'd used him as a reference on my resume, and he said, great, I'll say some nice things about you. And we hung up, but he called me back pretty quickly and said, wait a minute, we're creating a position here. We're starting a production company, and we want somebody in marketing for the studios to raise wave the flag, go to New York and LA and solicit business for the studios. He said, why don't you come interview? And I did, and after about 3 interviews with a guy in a suit, who was the guy that headed up the video department here, because that was all corporate stuff, and I got the job. I don't think that guy wanted me to hire me, but John probably, I think, overruled him. Because a couple of things, by that time, it's Big Star was known to certainly music writers and people that were pretty heavy into music, like A&R people would be. So, and then my major at Memphis State was marketing. So the two kind of worked hand in hand, and I could, in some part, call the A&R folks in New York and LA and get them on the phone. Others had to work a bit. Call like 20 times and they finally pick up. But they also had, probably 100 other people trying to get their attention. But I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling.
No, that's interesting. So what was that era like for you in that beginning, working with John again?
John's always been a mentor. All his life, he just came by it naturally, I think. And so I continued to learn things from John and how to pursue things. I never quite got his attention to detail or methodology. He always had a method.
So, Zach, let's take just a second to talk about the recording of Nature Boy. What comes to mind when you hear Big Star's rendition of that song?
Can't believe they pulled it off so well. Take a song like that, kind of part of the American Songbook, and adapt it. It turned it into this sort of atmospheric rock ballad. It really surprised me the first time I heard it, and it also speaks to the haunting quality of Alex Chilton's voice. I mean, Alex Chilton's voice should not work as well as it does on paper, on those Big Star albums. It's a little thin. It's almost boyish. It's high. And it's absolutely one of the most just affecting voices I've ever heard. And, that is a haunting cover version of that song.
You know, what's really amazing to me is that there are certain songs that if they're over-covered and too many people record it, then it kind of loses part of the magic of the communication that it's supposed to be. And this song is a perfect example of how two different people can record the same song. It's the same lyrics, and it means completely different things. Nat King Cole, of course, recorded the original in 1947 and owned it. And when you listen to his recording, you think, wow, that's his voice, right? That's the definition of Nat King Cole's voice. It's not his biggest hit. It's not the one that you necessarily hum along to. You don't know all the words, but my gosh, that song to me, it's always defined really the power of Nat King Cole. The same way you just described the Big Star, you know, that lyric is perfect for that. And the meaning of the one line, the greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return, is unbelievably different between those two versions.
And if I can say so, when I hear Big Star cover it and Alex Chilton sing that line, I don't necessarily believe it. I think he is struggling with that issue right then. You know, he's looking for that. He's seeking that. And he is singing that line with total solemnity. It's more of a plea and a wish when he sings it.
Absolutely, as opposed to Nat, who owned it, and you feel, he learned that lesson. Now he's departing it on us, right? It's the exact opposite when Alex does it. You think, oh man, he's struggling like I am with that.
It's heartbreaking. It's beautiful.
It's unbelievable. And of course, the bass hitting the drum at the end is always kind of cool too. Anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Beautiful recording and very special for sure.
John was a pilot as well, and he had his instructor's rating. In the 70s, he gave us flying lessons. And the analogy is that before you would actually get in the plane and start the engine and get on the taxiway and then the runway, there was a checklist of things that you would go through. And John was always very thorough about that. And that's why he made such an amazing engineer too, because he was always very thorough about, one, his knowledge of how gear worked and signal flow. And, you know, if you turned a knob, what does it actually do? Why does it work? Why does it create the sound that it does? And he was always very methodical in his mixing and his engineering so I. But at any rate, I don't know. I lied. One thing, maybe the biggest thing for me, is because I was a shy kid, and was still maybe a little shy, even though I was 31 maybe when I came back at Ardent. Was and I kind of figured this out in the 70s too, as I was sort of shy, and I'd sort of looked around at the people around me and thought, well, it must be okay. You know, there's some good folks around me. And then I get to Ardent, and this all of a sudden it's business. And I'm thinking, well, you know, must be okay. John thinks I'm okay. And John thinks I'm going to work in this business role. And it worked. We saw success with a production company, and business started kind of rolling in from the trips I'd make to New York and L.A. and the relationships. So it was all good.
What were some of the projects that you worked on that you were particularly enamored with or felt were helpful to the studio?
Well, the first was John Kilzer. And John Hampton and Keith Sykes kind of co-produced that, and Hampton engineered it. And so I got on a plane with cassettes and went to New York and played it for some A&R people, then went to L.A. and played it for Teresa Ensenada Geffen, and she liked it, but, you know, maybe was looking to hear more stuff from John, and so maybe 6, 7, 8 months later, I get on a plane again and make the rounds and get back to Teresa Ensenada Geffen and played her some demos, and she really liked it and she played it for Tom Zutaut, and they wound up signing John. And the good thing that, aside from getting Kilzer signed, was that they liked what Hampton and Keith Sykes did, so they wound up producing that record here at Ardent. So we wound up with studio time sold. Hampton, got hired on as the engineer and co-producer, and Keith got work out of that. And we also, here's an example of what we can do at Ardent as a studio. And Teresa Ensenat happened to be married to Steve Earle, and Steve was looking to work outside of Nashville, maybe something with a little more rock edge. And Teresa, by that point, had met Joe Hardy, and Joe had worked with ZZ Top on a lot of records, and so Steve wound up working with Joe Hardy here on Copperhead Road, tracked it and mixed it here, and then Joe mixed the hard way here. So that one of the relationships, and then there were a couple of other bands that came, and along the way, and the next was Tora Tora. I placed with A&M and Brian Huttenhauer there. I'd already met Brian, Robin Wilson of the Gin Blossoms, because I'd gone to South by Southwest and just heard them and really liked the band and gave Robin my card and stuff. But Brian Huttenhauer signed them to A&M and had gotten into working on their record and their debut, and apparently got a lot into their budget and didn't have anything to show for it that he was happy with. So he called us and said, hey, I've already spent this many thousands of dollars. Here's what's left. Would you see if Hampton will produce this? And they're at Ardent. Of course, we said yes. And hell, what was left in that budget was probably twice what anybody has these days. And so Hampton wound up working with the Gin Blossoms and produced all those records, and that was from Tora Tora. And then Hampton mixed Soundgarden's, the little video they did, Soundgarden Live. He did that, and wow, I think there was something else. We're building relationships and introducing to people to talent that was here. So it started. I guess the last group I pitched was Skillet, and that was to Andy Karp at Atlantic, and Andy signed them. And the Skillet had been doing maybe $120,000 for us on the Ardent label, and Ardent in 1995 had a Christian label and a mainstream label, and Skillet were on the Christian label, but at that point they were doing things that I thought would work in mainstream and would work well with a major, and so I'd been playing things for Andy anyway, and so Andy picked Skillet up, and they went from 120. We kept Christian distribution, and they got mainstream, but their first Atlantic partnership was $350,000, I think, and the next was over 500, and the next was over $1 million. So that worked. It was those were those were different times. People had a lot of money, and labels were making money, and they were spending money, and so it's still a good time. It's just you have to be a bit more frugal about things.
So that was Jody talking about John Fry hiring him as in a marketing position and projects that he worked on. And next up, we're going to get into songwriting a little bit.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of the songwriting process for Big Star are just some of the individual elements. I mean, there's so much that went into these productions, if you will, especially the third album, that I think is worthy of taking a quick pause and kind of getting our bearings on this. Zach, tell me about the third album.
Big Star's third album is not only my favorite of the three and a lot of fans' favorite, but I think in some ways it's their most influential. It's their most postmodern. It's their most disjointed. It cuts the deepest. It was put together just by Alex Chilton and Jody Stephens, along with the producers and engineers who were in the studio. It never had a final track listing. Alex Chilton never agreed on the final track listing, although I think the kind of quote-unquote official 1978 release has a perfect track listing. It's a fantastic way to listen to the album if anybody can get their hands on the vinyl or program it, digitally as a playlist. The third album it's very unique. I don't know that it's totally been reproduced, although a lot of bands like, Wilco have sort of tampered with the same kind of format.
Right.
You have this beautiful Baroque pop album that's also incredibly disjointed, incredibly dark. I mean, one of the songs is called Holocaust. It's about, this isn't the person who made this album knew his band was breaking up. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Nighttime, which I think, one of Big Star's most famous songs is on there. But this little beautiful gem in the album is For You, Jody's song. And it's just this autumnal, beautiful pop rock song. Jody sings it beautifully. One of the things he talks about was bringing in the strings. I had actually thought he arranged them, although it sounds like he had some help on that. But funny enough, bringing in the strings for You, according to Jody, really jump-started the use of strings on that album. And it's funny because I think the metaphor we talked about beforehand, Dan, it would be like somebody giving, the Edge of U2 a Roland Space Echo pedal. It's such a foundational sound to the album. So hearing Jody's, it was like hearing him directly, getting your hands on the Dead Sea Scrolls and reading directly, hearing him talk about that. That was a piece that I was unfamiliar with. So
yeah, amazing. And the space, one of the concepts that I brought in this conversation before we were rolling is, to me, when I listen to the third album, which is one of my favorites also, I hear space. And, maybe part of it is production. They just wanted to dump the strings. At one point, the pots all go down, right?
Right.
The faders. But that is a magical element to me, because not every rock band did that or knew to do that. And I think that added an element that has always been endearing to me. And speaking of songwriting, Zach, one of the things that we started doing here for the Music History Project is reading some of the lyrics as it were written as a poem or just as a letter, and not reading it from the point of view of wanting to sing along, but just hearing those words. So I've asked Elizabeth to help us with just a few of the words from For You, if you don't mind.
A dramatic reading.
By Elizabeth Hale.
Now, good lyrics. They probably work better as lyrics than poetry, just saying. But
this might be
lyrics.
A little easier than last episodes for me not to sing along, but that's just a shot in the dark. For you. When I come home so cold at night, you'll have the fireplace burning bright. Thoughts of how it's going to be and how I'll spend those cold, cold nights warm by you. And in these autumn days, I wander through the leaves, thinking of those winter nights I'll spend with you. Fiend. Done.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? It's fun. Yeah, it's fun to hear.
Now,
we did American Pie that way, by the way, for our buddy Holly, and it was awesome to hear her.
If anyone comes after me for copyright, Dan made me do it.
No, we're doing in tribute.
Well, and when you listen to this, it's funny hearing those lyrics that way too. You hear this in the interview with Jody. This is just a sweet, tender human being. He lived that song. Whoever the lucky person was he wrote that song for. He clear those were genuine emotions for that young man at the time.
So has your position changed?
I don't travel so much anymore because that same model doesn't work. Bands have access to so much now that they don't. At that point, recording at a studio was maybe the only way you could get a recording of what you're doing, and there was an expense involved in that too. Getting the attention of an A&R person was really, really hard because they had so many people trying to get their attention, and just the expense of going to New York and LA and shopping things, and so relationships that I built through that. So all that worked for us, but it doesn't work in today's model because people can essentially demo things at home, and not quite like the experience here at all, but they can get their ideas down. They can develop audiences through the internet and live. But I mean, with majors, you still have to, even more so now, you have to create a bigger story to be signed. Independence, maybe not so much, but my title is Director of Production, and here at Ardent, and I was back in maybe January or February of this year. I was approached by an Austin band called The Reputations to produce their new one, and they sent me a record and thought it sounded great, good players, great singers, and I hadn't heard any of the new material yet, but I figured it'd work, and we scheduled a time for them to come in, and by that point, I have a band called Those Pretty Wrongs with Luther Russell out of L.A., and we'd released our debut record May 2016, and I'd co-produced that with Luther, and that was a good time, really good time. And so I was looking to kind of have that experience again, and not play this time though, and just sit in the producer chair and had that experience. That was awesome because these guys came prepared. It was a matter of we had 7 days to do 10 songs, start to finish, track, overdub, and mix. And they came prepared, and it was just filtering through all the good ideas they had, because we couldn't use all of them. Filtering through the good ideas and kind of paring it down when I thought, okay, we have what we need. We don't need 2 more acoustic guitars or something. And so that was a great experience. So I thought, well, I'll hang my shingle out as a producer. And so that's kind of my mission now is to produce, get into producing bands and helping bands along that way.
That's very interesting. That's cool. I was going to ask you if it's surprising to you that there continues to be interest in Big Star. Does that surprise you?
Well, I'll put it this way. I'm such a fan of that music and enjoyed being such a part of it that I figured, why wouldn't everybody else? So from that perspective, am I surprised? No. Alex and Chris and these emotive voices and these killer guitar lines and it's great songs. I don't know. September Girls. I mean, that Strat intro just rings out like a clarion call. So it's just amazing. And I didn't do that, so I can say that. It's exciting stuff to me. Nothing like a great melody delivered by somebody that you share some emotion with.
What about your songwriting? Like, for you, things like that. How did that come about?
Well, I was looking to learn how to play guitar, and Andy Hummel gave me an acoustic guitar, and that actually was owned by Chris and was used on the first record, and Andy wound up with it, but that's on its own story. And so I was learning how to play guitar, and he gave it to me. He said, "Here, have this one." He didn't need it. He had another one. So I did. Alex taught me some chords, and so I put chords together and came up with a melody line and lyrics, and that's how For You came up. And what I'm doing now with Those Pretty Wrongs is Luther Russell and I got together and to play some Big Star songs at the Big Star documentary screenings in L.A. And Luther said, well, why don't we write some songs together? And, trust is a big thing, and I was an admirer of Luther's, and Luther's great. He's a really creative guy, piano, guitar, plays drums and too. And so I had some ideas for a couple of songs, melody lines and lyrics, and I just called his phone and sang them to his voicemail. And he added, music to them, guitar and that sort of thing. And then we got around to, I'd need some lyrics, and Luther would come up with lyrics, or Luther would come up with a song and maybe some of a melody line, and I'd finish the lyrics, and I'd do the lyrics and some of the melody line, and I don't know, it's just great collaboration. The last song we wrote together, Mystery Trip, Luther said, do you have any lyrics at all? Kind of hanging around. I thought, well, yeah, I've got this song called Mystery Trip, some lyrics, and sent them to him, and early afternoon, in that late afternoon, he said, you won't believe this, but I already have this song, music for this song, and a melody line, and the lyrics fit right in. So it just clicked. I mean, some of it's discipline to sit down and do it, and some of it is just luck. You have to be prepared. What is it? Luck is the combination of opportunity and preparedness or something. But that's, songwriting, it's a mystery, really. It's like having a conversation with somebody. How do you instantly put these words together to communicate? It's, I guess if you hang around music long enough, or if you have enough input, then these melodic ideas or lyrics come together. And for me, it's really having the discipline to, if I'm in a car and I think of a melody line, pull over and sing the melody line into my, now we have recorders in our phones. You can record the melody line. If I have a lyric idea, sit down, write it down, text yourself the lyric. But it's having the discipline to follow that idea right then, right there. Because if you wait 10 minutes, for me, it's gone. Or you think, oh man, that's such a great idea, I'll remember it, and then 30 minutes later it's gone, and I'm thinking, why didn't I write it down? But it's having that discipline, and I don't know, there are a lot of songwriters out there that this isn't news to, but to me, it's still a new kind of exciting process. And we did that first record, and now we're like 8 songs into our second that we've written so far. So it's fun. There's nothing like the whole creative thing for excitement, really. It's kind of a high.
All right, so that was Jody talking about quite a bit about songwriting, and we're going to have Dan introduce our next clip, which focuses a little bit heavier on John Hampton.
So the engineer that was sitting in the studio in July of 2000 at Ardent in Memphis, when I walked in there, eagerly waiting to interview John Fry for the NAMM Oral History program, happened to be John Hampton, who I was a big fan of. In fact, I had no idea he was there that day. So after being a little giddy, I said, hey, can we spend a few minutes? And he was on his way out, spent maybe 10 minutes with me, but it was 10 minutes I won't forget. He was an amazing guy, very warm, and I was really very enamored with the opportunity to here's the guy who was mixing Led Zeppelin and some other great albums and recording artists that went through the Ardent Studios in the 70s, and was really John's best friend. And that was another kind of compelling realization to me, is that these guys not only worked together but really got along very, very well. And so back in 2000, at the beginning of the oral history program, again, it was a wonderful opportunity to have somebody who could kind of guide me. So I called him often over the years and asked him for advice. And so when we had the opportunity to talk to Jody in that same very studio, some 16 years later, I asked him about John Hampton. I'd love to ask you about John Hampton. I was lucky enough to interview him when I was here 17 years ago, along with interviewing John Fry, and both those guys had a big impact on me. I really was enamored with the whole idea of telling the story of engineers since that time, and I've interviewed many engineers as a result. And I just would love to. I didn't get to know him other than that one interview, and I wondered, what sort of guy did you find John to be?
Hampton, brilliant. I mean, he came up under John Fry, and he was the same kind of guy. He had that same kind of brilliance. He had he, like John Fry, had a great set of ears, and Hampton came up as a technician I think, first, and then got into engineering. So he knew also that when you turned a knob, why did it make the sound that it made, and signal flow and process. I don't know all that, but he was just, and he could put all this information to good use because he had a great set of ears and how sounds work together and how balancing and mixing and how all that worked. Yeah, Hampton was brilliant. Great killer drum sound. Other great sounds too, but I think he was known for his drum sounds.
Do you have a favorite story of John Fry, by the way?
John Fry he walks into Studio B, and this is an example of how simple things can be in the midst of all this complicated stuff. And all this big terminology with regard to audio. And so John Fry walks into Studio B, and the engineers sitting at the console, and they look over to John looking for some advice, and they say, "John, how do I get this vocal right? I just can't, I've boosted it at 2K, the high end at 2 dB, and I'm not an engineer, so using this, and John just walks over to the console and grabs the knob, and he said, "Just turn it till it sounds good. You just use your ears, don't worry about where it is in the scheme of things whether it's 1 or 6 or 2 dB or 3 or whatever it is. It just, pay attention to your ears." Practical knowledge.
So is there something in music you haven't done that you'd like to do?
I haven't written 2 albums worth of stuff, worth of music, and so we're about to complete that. So that's certainly a goal. And then play some more gigs. We with the release of the first record, actually we played some dates in Australia right before that record came out, and we went to Spain and played New York and a lot of different, Chicago and Portland and LA and Seattle, and we just did this past May, I guess, did 6 dates in England. So yeah, I look to doing getting our second album done and playing some more dates. That's where it's fun, sharing this stuff with people and continue to build relationships.
Very cool. Well, this is awesome. Is there anything else that we should add?
I don't know. This is the room where, maybe I already said this. This is the room where Big Star mixed all its records, and including In Space, mind you, but #1 record, and Radio City in 3rd, and In Space, and a lot of great stuff done in this room. Jack White brought the Rockin' Tours Broken Boy Soldier here on a 8-track 1-inch tape. Hampton mixed that here, and then he brought White Stripes' Get Behind Me Satan and 8-track 1-inch, and we transferred to 16-track 2-inch so they'd have an extra track for automation. But he stayed at pure analog, and I don't know. We just had a group called the Push Stars in. It's awesome in here, and over the years, a lot of different. REM did Green in here. The Afghan Wigs did Black Love and Gentlemen. Tom Dowd worked out of this room on a Leonard Skinner record, an Allman Brothers record, and a Primal Scream record, and another record as well. So a lot of folks, Jimmy and Stevie Ray Vaughan did the Vaughan Brothers. Hampton tracked that in here. A lot of history. This building's been around since '71, so 46 years. So a lot could happen. And like John Fry said, magic can happen here, because it has, and it's it's a great vibe to have in a room. And
well said. Thank you so much for having us over. I really appreciate it.
Glad to do it. Yeah, thanks for your interest. Sometimes it's really hard to get people interested in stuff. So I always appreciate the interest people have.
So that's the conclusion of our interview with Jody Stephens. Just like Mike mentioned earlier, if you want to check out this interview or any of our others in our collection, you can do so on our website. You can always drop us an email if you have recommendations, and please rate or review this podcast. And final thoughts. Yay.
Okay, I'll go first on final thoughts today. This is a great opportunity to say that if my friend Zach Phillips didn't suggest that while I was in Memphis that we would stop and interview Jody Stephens, I'm sure I would get to it eventually, but I may not. So hats off to you for the great idea. I really appreciate your support.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm so glad you're able to get it.
Mike, you want to go next? We'll just go around the table.
Sure. Piggybacking off that a little bit, I think that shows the importance of recommendations with this collection. It wouldn't be nearly as big if we didn't have people like Zach and others at the NAMM building and just friends recommending people that we may overlook for the collection. So
good point.
It's really a big deal when someone recommends an interview for us, and it can sometimes lead to amazing interviews like this one.
So what would they do if they had an idea?
They can send us an email at library@namm.org.
Nice. Final thoughts, Elizabeth?
Well, Zach's next. Do we want him to go last?
I thought we would let him go last.
All right, final thoughts. I thought that everybody did such an excellent job with this podcast that I'm going to listen to all 3 albums.
Wow.
Yay. I think you should.
Thank you. Thanks.
We made an
I won't be doing anything else today
Our job
at work
is done.
besides listening to those albums. Don't bother me. All right, Zach, final thoughts.
That's a good use of 2.5
Company time.
hours. I like that. Final thought, just there were a couple times during the interview that Jody had said something to the effect of, well, I'm kind of making a short story long, and all I could think is this is one humble, accomplished person, and every time he said that, I just thought, no, Jody, keep going. We want to hear more. So it was a really strong interview. Yeah, thanks for getting it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great stuff.
All right. Once again, thanks, Zach, for joining us, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.